Some see them as idyllic middle-class communities, others as retrograde urban sprawl. However you think about them, the suburbs have evolved well beyond any 1950s-era stereotype of largely residential havens. And that's got residents and urban planners reevaluating how to make them work better for everyone. Joining us now for more, in Waterloo, Ontario, Marcus Mose, professor in the School of Planning at the University of Waterloo and co-editor of Still Detached and Subdivided: Suburban Ways of Living in 21st Century North America. And back here in our studio, Crystal Legacy, senior lecturer in urban planning at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and Roger Kyle, York Research Chair in Global Suburban Studies at York University and the author of the forthcoming Suburban Planet: Making the World Urban from the Outside In. So good to have you two. You haven't been here in a long time. Roger, nice to see you again. Your first time here?
It is, thank you.
You're from here originally, aren't you?
I am from here. I grew up in Brantford, Ontario.
Brantford, but you're in Australia now.
I live in Australia for the last 12 years.
Okay. And Marcus, nice to have you on the line from Waterloo, Ontario as well. Let's just get a bit of a fact file to start us off here to give a foundation for our discussion. We are apparently a suburban nation with 2/3 of Canadians living in suburbs. In our largest metropolitan areas, suburban residents make up more than 80% of the total population. In Toronto, 88% of total population growth between the years 2006 and 2011 happened in the suburbs. In Ottawa-Gatineau, that figure is 96% of total population growth happening in the suburbs. That according to Suburban Nation. Roger, get us started here. In most urban cores in Canada, you see massive growth happening in those cores, condominiums everywhere, new townhouses and so on. And yet, have I got this right? The suburbs are growing even faster than that?
Yes, they are. They are growing faster, in most cases in relative terms, than most of the core city. In Toronto, that would be the amalgamated city of Toronto. The exception is what we call condo land, where there has been a considerable increase in relative terms. But in absolute terms, the suburbs way outweigh the growth in the core city.
So we are going to have to reevaluate, and I think that's what this program is for, our notions of sprawl, single-family homes, massive 5-car garages, tidy subdivisions outside city cores. That's the stereotype of suburbs. How accurate is that today?
I think you're spot on. And the other thing that I would add to that list is car dependency. And in Australia, where I undertake most of my research, although often comparing with Canadian cities, we also talk about transport disadvantage. So one of the things that we're concerned about in our suburbs in Australian cities, and I'm sure it's true here in Canadian cities, is the lack of choice in terms of our ability to get around the city.
So there is or there is not more sort of diversity in suburban life than we thought from, say, 50, 60 years ago?
I would agree with that, yes.
There is?
I think so.
Okay, Marcus, you're going to take us through a few examples of this right now, because in your book, you do point out that suburbs come in many shapes and sizes, and we're going to go through 3 graphics here, and you take us through it. For example, high-rise suburbs. What's the story there?
Yeah, so especially in Canadian suburbs, in the large cities like Toronto and Montreal, we've had high-rises in the suburbs since the 1970s. Many of these were built as affordable housing. Now they are actually, in some cases, remain some of the few affordable rental housing that we have in our cities. So high-rise suburbs are, those towers that are up to 20 and sometimes more stories tall that you see not in the downtown, but out, by past the 401, or at least within the 401 range.
Okay, let's do a second example here. And again, this may have sounded like an oxymoron some time ago, but transit-oriented suburbs. What's the story there?
Well, it's similar in the sense to the first one, in the sense that you're looking at a high-rise form. But planners have now, for some time, advocated for higher densities in the suburbs so that you can serve them with transit, because you need that density to adequately serve, have a capacity for transit. And so some, parts of the suburbs are purposely being densified with the goal to connect them to higher order transit.
And let's do one more. Distant suburbs. What's going on there?
Yeah, the distant suburbs are really actually towns and cities in their own right. And where I am right now, Kitchener-Waterloo, places like Peterborough, places like Barrie, and so forth, are places that are sort of within the reach of the Greater Toronto area. Are, for many people who live there, wouldn't consider themselves to be suburban residents. But these places are so interconnected into that larger regional metropolitan economy that there are ways that we can think about them as new types of suburbs in that regional sense.
Now, despite the fact, Crystal, that stuff is changing, there is a certain, I think it's fair to say, a certain snobbery among people who live in the cities, right in the middle of Toronto or right in the middle of Ottawa or something, to suburban lifestyle, which was considered very desirable a half a century ago or 30 years ago, and has somehow now been considered passé or something. So is that, how did that happen, where it went from what we all wanted once upon a time, house in the suburbs, picket fence, dog, 2.2 kids, whatever, to considered passé?
Well, I think one of the major factors that we need to discuss and put on the table is just housing affordability. And many of the folks who are living in suburbs today are perhaps opting to live in these environments because they are trading off their interest in buying perhaps a larger home with a backyard and perhaps a more of a Main Street feel to a more sort of urban environment where in that context, they might be a little bit closer to work and other social services. So that's certainly a factor, yes.
Got it. Roger, now in the States, of course, I take no pleasure in using this expression, but it was an expression from the 70s that we heard a lot, white flight. The suburbs developed because whites in the cities were afraid of living in the cities and therefore moved to the suburbs. I don't think we experienced that in Canada in the same way, did we?
Well, not to the same degree, but Canada is kidding itself if it uses only the United States as a way to distance themselves from that, the idea of the racialization of the city, which, is alive and well in Canada. So that is a factor that also plays into people's decisions. But there were other things that Mark has already referred to. The city of Toronto and to some degree some of the other larger cities in Canada have aspects of European urbanization, or today Asian urbanization. And so you had the choice or the constraint of the housing market, which often, the choice is often overrated. The choice and the constraint happens in a completely different landscape. The idea of a flight from Toronto makes no sense when you look at how housing was developed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, because under the metro regime since 54, large housing estates were built in the suburbs for middle-class people. They tended to be mixed in form. They had high-rise buildings, row houses, and single-family homes. To go there was not necessarily a flight. Now, today, we have
Can I just jump in? I want to make sure I understand this. We have, in some respects, do I understand this right, the opposite phenomenon happening here?
Yeah, but there are, this is, it's partly a question of racialized minorities, who of course in those suburban areas are now majorities. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit odd that we keep referring to them as minorities as we are living in Toronto in an urban area, which is majority non-white.
Great point.
So I think we need to change our language there. But there are two kinds of ways in which these people are looked at. There are these so-called problem areas in the old inner suburbs of Toronto that are in many instances in the housing estates in those tower neighborhoods. But the more important thing about those is that there are poor people to some degree and people who are stuck in particular constraints of the housing market. They're not able to move and they don't really choose to live there. And crime is maybe one aspect, but you have crime everywhere. There's crime in gated white communities too. So that I wouldn't think is the most important aspect. The most important aspect is that these communities are cut off, segregated, and badly serviced, as Crystal said earlier. But there is the other suburban area, which is now inhabited largely by new immigrants, and those new immigrants tend to be from non-European backgrounds too.
Well, Crystal,
I just want to add one thing, is they tend to be aspirational middle classes to some degree, and in the public discourse they are being celebrated rather than vilified. So you have these strange mixes of discourses in the public debate. Sometimes the suburbs are good, sometimes the suburbs are bad, sometimes, immigration is an issue of aspiration and development, sometimes it's a problem. So, we need to figure this out.
Okay, Crystal, can you weigh in on how diverse or not you think the suburbs are in Canada, generally speaking, today?
Well, I think they're incredibly diverse. I mean, in terms of just demographic makeup, you're seeing, like in a community like Brampton, you're seeing a demographic shift in terms of age groups. I've done a little bit of research there, and it's sort of a younger...
It's much younger today.
Just absolutely, generation coming through who have different sort of expectations of what suburbia ought to be for them as they, grow old and establish their families.
Help us understand that a little better. The expectations of, say, the 95% of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who lived in Brampton 50 years ago differ from the almost majority South Asian population much younger today. In what way?
Well, I would say one of the ways in which they differ is just in terms of their, perhaps their relationship to the city. I mean,
They want a real city.
Some migrant groups, are coming from very urban environments, and others, perhaps are buying their first home, but have otherwise lived in downtown Toronto or near, the inner city of Toronto. So their experience of the city is very different, and perhaps they want to replicate that or represent that in some way. So it's very interesting to see the debates that are happening there in a community like Brampton.
Marcus, is it reasonable to expect that the suburbs will ever have the kind of economic concentration in their downtowns that we find, say, in the downtown cores of Toronto, Ottawa, Hamilton, etc.?
I don't know if they will take the same form, but certainly in terms of number of jobs, we're already looking at a larger share, but they're more dispersed. But if you look at Toronto, for instance, at the Toronto region, you have the largest concentration of employment in the downtown still, and that's actually still quite healthy and growing. But you also have a secondary node in and around the airport in Mississauga. And there are other employment nodes throughout the suburban area. So as we have been planning for intensification, planning for employment nodes through places to grow, and the growth plan, we're going to see some of those employment areas become more concentrated. Will they ever out compete, so to speak, the downtown? That's the kind of forecast that's very difficult to make, and I'm not sure I want to put my money on that one.
Okay, well, to help us out on this one then. Mississauga is the third biggest city in Ontario. It's Toronto, Ottawa, Mississauga. It has just boomed over the last 25 years. But if you talk to people in Toronto, they'd probably tell you that Mississauga was a suburb. So you've got to decide this for us now. Is it a city or is it a suburb?
It's a really good question. The way I approach this in my work is to think about suburban ways of living, and both Crystal and Roger have talked about this before, about sort of how in North America suburban ways of living are defined at least one way by looking at where single detached homes are, where people drive, and where there's a high share of home ownership. And look through that lens, yes, large parts of Mississauga are probably suburban, but there are also other parts where you suddenly see higher density housing forms. You're seeing lots of conversations and some action too on the policy front in terms of bringing more transit into these areas. So I think it's part of what we're trying to do in our research about suburbs is actually move away from this dichotomy of it's a city, it's a suburb, because you actually see people living suburban ways of life in different parts of the metropolitan area, whether that's in Mississauga or actually even, I might say in downtown Toronto, you have people living quite suburban ways of life in the way that there are areas in and around the downtown that are single-family homes owned and where people still drive, even though they're actually in a fairly dense transit-supportive neighborhood.
Gotcha. Roger, how about this? The conventional wisdom is that most of the best entertainment is in the urban cores of this province and country. The sports arenas are there, the live theater is there, the best restaurants are there, the best tourist attractions are there. How much of any of that is now in suburban Canada?
Obviously, some of the larger cultural institutions and the sports arenas and all that are downtown. And that has
Although
been
not in Ottawa.
Well, not in Ottawa, yeah.
Although it's coming.
It's true, and Markham is still always, looking at the possibility of having an NHL team. There was talk before the Toronto FC came to the region whether the stadium could be up there somewhere at York University. So this is not decided forever. But of course, the investments have been made in the downtown core. There's a certain magnetism there. But if you go away a little bit from the larger institutional offerings in culture and sports and entertainment, you find a lot of life in the suburbs. Starting at the place where I work, which is at York University, we have a fantastic art gallery. We have all kinds of fine arts performances. We have, of course, in the communities around York University, to stay with that example, we have a very lively hip-hop culture. We have a very lively arts culture, a street arts culture.
World-class tennis tournament there every summer.
World-class tennis tournament, which again is one of the institutional factors. But I think it's important to understand that if the majority of the diversity and the majority of new immigration is in the suburbs, you can expect that there is some life there.
Crystal, here in the capital city of the province of Ontario, we can see how difficult and pricey it is just to build one subway stop. The political debates are awesome, and the price is equally as awesome. And I don't know, maybe put your Australian hat on here for a while and make some comparing and contrasting comments about how other jurisdictions around this world figure out how to build light rail transit in the suburbs, subways in the suburbs. I don't know. How do they do it?
How do they do it? Well, to draw the comparison is probably really unfair because in the city that I live in at the moment, Melbourne, Australia, and I would put Sydney, Australia, as well as Perth, Australia, into that same camp. We're having a debate between rail versus toll roads at the moment. And so one of the reasons why I was attracted to come back to Ontario and do some research here on infrastructure planning was in part because I found the conflict around light rail really interesting. Who can dispute light rail, but of course there's lots of reasons why we can dispute light rail, and I find that incredibly interesting. And part of that is in the regions where I'm looking at light rail, Hamilton, Mississauga, Brampton, light rail has become a proxy for a bigger conversation around what kind of city do they want to live in. These are, relatively suburban environments, although maybe Hamilton is a bit more sort of urban in some respects, who are coming to terms with the fact that, their environments are going to shift from a car-dependent suburban experience to one that, might be prioritizing or at least starting the expansion of light rail. And I mean, that's a really interesting debate to go and be part of, particularly since my experience in Brantford and then at Waterloo, where I start and where I studied, and then to come to Hamilton to see where a city that was otherwise always a very car-dependent city and a low-density city, based on my experience, is now deciding to, well, wait a minute, there's something in this light rail thing that we want to be a part of, and it draws investment into the downtown core.
Let me pick up on those three cities that you just mentioned in Australia. Are any of those cities trying to build subways to the suburbs?
Well, I mean, one of the fantastic things about Melbourne grew...
You say it like an Aussie now. You know
I've been practicing for 12 years. Got it down, although my Australian counterpart may dispute that. So the Australian city, the Melbourne, grew and expanded as a result of the gold rush in the late 1800s. And as a result of that money and the investment, we got beautiful Victorian architecture, but we also got a fairly expansive a train system as well as a tram system. So much of our suburbs actually grew in response to the rail network initially, but then of course the advent of the car expanded that out even further. And so we have quite low density suburbs now in the Australian city.
How about here, Roger? How do they deal with...
Yeah,
do you want to add something? Sure.
I think it's important to say that while LRT takes a lot of attention, and here now the Metrolinx rollout with the GO trains, this is very, very important to have our focus on that. We need to also see that the suburbs, of course, have historically been the place where all those big infrastructures go that the people didn't want in the inner city. But we pride ourselves in Toronto of having stopped the Suburban Expressway, but the 407 was built. When Pearson
the 407 was built because there was nothing there.
Well,
in a way that the Spadina
to say nothing there is I don't think that's quite the right way to put it.
Let me rephrase.
I'm saying it would not have destroyed the same kind of housing.
That's the way. That's the way to put it.
But if you built a 6 or 8 lane highway anywhere, you make a statement on what you expect to develop around it. And that is what the 407 was. But more importantly, perhaps, when Pearson was expanded, I think now 15 years ago, 10 years ago in the aughts, there was no public outcry, there was no problem. So often when I interview politicians they say, why don't we do everything like Pearson Airport, right? We just get a bunch of people together, we hire a guy from San Francisco who will run the show, and we're just gonna, actually, that's gonna happen now at the Portlands, exactly the same thing. So, the problem is that we often don't see those infrastructures that actually carry much of the weight of the region. That is the big highways, that is the big, just north of York University, for example, when I look out the window, I see the train, the freight train managing station, I forget the name now. But there are many of these mega infrastructures that are just built without the public taking any notice, which is, of course, exactly the same kind of invisibility that happens to those mega employment zones that Pamela Bley and Marcy Birchfield are telling us about, that Marcus mentioned earlier, which are also up there and unserviced to some degree by transit, but they are serviced for the trucks who come and roll in there, in and out and in and out, and are part of the larger suburban economy.
Marcus, in your view, of course, there's been a great effort to maintain greenbelts around the areas north of the city of Toronto. Do those help or hurt with urban sprawl, in your opinion?
Yeah, the question is unfortunately not quite as straightforward as to whether it helps or hurts. It's quite complex, which is not meant to be a cop-out, but rather to say that, clearly if you're going to put a boundary in place as to how far the city can grow, that's going to prevent growth from going, especially if it's got legislative teeth and if the areas are going to be protected. The other side to it is, though, that it sometimes can result in leapfrog development. So, developments actually kind of jumping over the greenbelt into further flung areas that are then becoming interconnected into the urban region or the metropolitan region, and people are actually commuting even further in. Now, in southern Ontario, to some extent, we've kind of protected ourselves a little bit against that because we've got a really large regional approach to growth management where you have growth targets, even for places as far away as from downtown Toronto, like Kitchener-Waterloo, where we're also part of the growth planning. So, they can help, but they have to be done well.
If you wanted, Crystal, to transform existing suburbs into places that were deemed to be more pleasing to live in, and some of that's happening right now, right? There's LRTs going in, there's added density going in. What would you add to that list of things that would make suburbs better places to live?
Well, one of the policy initiatives in Australia at the moment, both at the federal level as well as at the state level in Victoria, where Melbourne's located, is this idea of a 20-minute city. So this idea that you can get to services, schools, hospitals, workplaces within a 20-minute walk, bicycle ride, or transit ride. And the challenges around achieving that, though, is quite considerable in terms of land use and transport sort of integration.
Does that kind of require everything to be in the core?
Well, no, it's about sort of decentering the metropolitan region. So in recognizing that, Melbourne CBD, Sydney CBD, Toronto CBD, central business district, downtown, will remain, the main sort of employment hub for a variety of different reasons. It's also to recognize that there are other areas in the region, such as like Mississauga and Brampton, which I think Mississauga particularly play a really interesting and strong role in terms of creating a hub of activity and employment around what was otherwise a fairly sort of low density environment up to that point. So.
Do you want to add something to that, Roger?
Yeah, I think that this is a great question. That our project that brings us together here in Toronto is a global project. So one of the things that I think we can learn from other places around the world is that Toronto could use a little bit more informality in its suburbs. So, if you look at other parts of the world, not necessarily classic Anglo-Saxon countries, but if you look at Africa or, parts of Asia and Latin America, there, of course, in those peripheries, you have a lot of building in backyards. You have, all kinds of developments that are not necessarily to building code. I think we can explore that possibility. Secondly, I think we should explore the possibility, which Metrolinx, for example, is already doing in the Toronto area, is to have better large-scale transit so that Barrie and Hamilton and these kinds of places have a tact in connectivity, so that when you go to the GO station, you have to wait 20 minutes for the next train if you miss one. And we don't have that right now. And the third thing is that our suburbs need to be much, much more small scale in terms of the development of mobility. I grew up in a southern German suburb, in a bungalow in quite a suburban area. But I did everything on my bike. My mother, when she went shopping, she would always go on her bike. She went shopping. And that had to do with the fact that there were markets. There were places, which is similar to what you were saying. Our suburbs are resistant to that sort of thing, and I think that we can do a lot to create, in those terms, these kinds of innovations: informality, larger scale connectivity, and smaller scale networking.
There's still the sense you got to get in your car if you want to pick up a quart of milk in the suburbs.
Oh, certainly,
Yeah.
certainly. And some people would prefer that as well, the ease of driving, the luxury of driving, the freedom that the car provides us. And I was wondering if I could just pick up a point that Roger mentioned, and that's informality. I just want to kind of tease that out a little bit further and ask, are you talking about creativity, or are you talking about a different kind of, or a different form of planning that perhaps is not?
Well, the suburbs are highly regulated in terms of planning regimes and what you can do. In some suburbs, you're not allowed to hang clothes on the clothesline in the backyard, these kinds of things. I think those regulations need to fall to a certain degree. I mean, you need to be able to garden the way you want to garden. You need to have domestic animals in the backyard. You need to have businesses in the backyard. You need to be able to sell stuff from your front yard. These kinds of things that happen everywhere in the world, except for those highly regulated suburban areas in North America. That has to happen.
Marcus, can I ask you to pick up on this notion that Crystal advanced a moment ago about the 20-minute city? It sounds like in a place like Waterloo that would be potentially possible. Can't imagine it in the capital city, but maybe I'm wrong. What do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. We can get almost everywhere in the region in 20 minutes by car, but that's just it. Most of it is by car. So it's like, in some ways kind of ironic that some of the smaller places in North America are actually even more car dependent than some of the bigger cities, especially if you look at their downtowns. So in theory, we could do it, but it requires a significant investment in cycling infrastructure, in transit infrastructure, and a re-centralization of growth into centers and secondary centers, so that you don't have to go as far as driving from one end of a region to another for certain kinds of tasks or chores. But the other thing I wanted to pick up on is this idea about centralization and density and adding transit in the suburbs. And I'm not disagreeing with any of that. That's very much needed. That's the direction we need to be heading in to make our suburbs more sustainable, to address issues related to climate change and reduce our car dependence. But at the same time, coming out of now 7 years of research on suburbs, I think one of the things that I've been becoming increasingly aware of is just this magnitude and size of the still low-density suburbs dependent on cars. And part of me thinks we can't densify our way out of the problem fast enough to deal with the problems associated with climate change. So in my mind, yes, we need to do those investments in transit, in cycling, and in walkability, but we also need to think about alternative fuel technology and cleaner cars if we wanted to make a dent into the emissions fast enough. That's not to say it has to be either or. Just recently, for instance, in The Guardian, there was an article about, we can't rely on cleaner cars, we have to rely on transit and cycling. That becomes sort of this one or the other debate, wherein I think we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. We actually want to explore the multitude of sustainability solutions that are out there and say, let's invest as broadly as we can to see which ones will partly be most successful, but also because of the scale of problem of automobility, it's just so large that, again, I don't think we can densify our way out of the problem fast enough.
Go ahead. We've got 30 seconds left. Crystal, it's all yours.
Sure, yeah. Sure, I just want to spruik, late Paul Mace, Associate Professor Paul Mace, who talked about network planning, the importance of integrating buses, rail, and light rail infrastructure into cross-subsidized in order to serve low-density urban environments and suburbs. So I agree absolutely with Marcus in that we can't build our way out of it, but it's not necessarily a chicken or an egg. I think transit can be better coordinated and networked in a far more sort of sophisticated way.
Could you mention the name of the university that you are at one more time?
Yes, I'm at the University of Melbourne. Melbourne.
Well done. Well said by somebody from Brantford, Ontario. There we go. Marcus Mose, it's good of you to join us on the line from Waterloo, Ontario, where you're at the University of Waterloo. Crystal Legacy at the University of Melbourne, I guess, is the way it's called, and Roger Kyle from York University. Good to have all three of you on TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.